Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. So this year's been kinda nuts, put it mildly, and I'll go a bit more into just how ridiculous things have been when we get to the end of November, but for now I felt like taking a look back at an old SNES game, which happens to be one of my favorites on the console, even though it's not very well known. Perhaps because of its unusual name, that game being Dragon View. Developed by a company known as Kotobuki System and published in North America through Kemco in late 1994. For those of you unfamiliar with this one, you may actually already be familiar with its predecessor, which is much more commonly known, as this game's original Japanese title is Super Draken. Yes, this game is the sequel to Draken, an action RPG released way back in the late 80s on numerous platforms, though the SNES port in particular was infamous for being both technologically ambitious, yet having incredibly poor design and progression decisions the whole way through, and not helped by having its story completely rewritten. I'll probably end up covering the DOS version on ADG someday, given that it's now available on digital storefronts, but apart from being directly connected via lore to the SNES version and having one specific mechanic in common, these two games don't play anything like each other, as this one's more of a hack-and-slash brawler/platformer/RPG/exploration/adventure hybrid. Yeah. I think that's part of the reason why the North American release of this game was distanced from its progenitor as much as possible, since the gameplay is completely different, though the story is a direct but distant sequel to the end of the first game. Well, again, an end of the first SNES game. Basically, the dragons have disappeared from the world after having had their control taken away by the player's party at the end of the original game. However, the dragons imparted a special pendant known as the Guardrock to be passed down through the generations to serve both as a symbol of power and to prove heritage if and when their powers need to be summoned. The opening cinematic of this game shows one of those descendants, a knight in training given the default name of Alex, giving the Guardrock to Katarina as a symbol of his unending love. However, not long into the opening gameplay, Katarina is kidnapped by an evil wizard going by the name of Argos, though fails to capture the Guardrock in the process. With the dragon pendant in hand, Alex swears to rescue Katarina and bring Argos to justice. Though, just like the story in the original SNES Draken, this one goes a lot of places, none of them being that straightforward. Heck, Argos isn't even the main villain, even though he sure seems like it for the first third of the game. Well, there's effectively two modes of gameplay here which you switch between, 3D exploration and 2D combat. And when you're outdoors, you explore the world from a first-person perspective with a massive number of tricks and optimizations going on to make this work, given the severely underpowered SNES CPU trying to handle this. The fact that the frame rate is as high as it is kinda impressive. Essentially, the way the rendering works is that there's a backdrop which makes up the floor and sky. Polygons are drawn to represent roads, rivers, cave entrances, and a few other flat things, while sprites with multiple pre-scaled sizes make up the foliage. When you approach a solid boundary, a tile map is used to create those walls to run into. And the only way this could be optimized even more is if they used Mode 7 rendering, but that would have limited the engine to the SNES. Which is ironic given that this game was never ported to any other consoles or computers, though I can't imagine they didn't at least consider it. Now, you don't actually have a very large viewing distance, so while you're out and exploring, you'll likely make use of the maps you find. The maps are acquired by talking to specific NPCs as you make story progress. Now, sometimes these NPCs are part of the main story, and so you'll get the map fragments no matter what, but sometimes the maps are acquired from NPCs that are not directly related to the story. Now, even once you find map fragments, you still need to explore anyways because there's lots of secrets to find, often hidden off the beaten path, many of which provide upgrades or bonuses. And when you enter any location whatsoever, the game goes into a 2D side-scrolling mode akin to a beat-em-up game, in that there's space between the background and foreground that you can move within, and you have to be aligned with enemies to attack them properly. Now, your 4 controls during combat allow you to attack with your currently equipped weapon, perform a special attack if you know how, use a selected item, which can also include magical items, which require MP, and of course, there's a jump button. The combat is fairly well done for the most part, though your survival relies heavily on being able to stay out of the line of sight of your opponents while still being able to attack them, and that can often get a bit tricky. At the start of the game, you have a level 1 sword, which can be powered up to greater levels of power as you progress. Now, your armor can be powered up in the same way, as can your secondary weapon, which you find early on, called the Hausa. This weapon is effectively a bladed boomerang, kind of like a chakram, except the blade doesn't encircle the entire weapon, and you're supposed to grab and throw it from the middle, which actually that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. In fact, one of my Patreon supporters, Jacob Rudolph, had a very simple question to ask. What the heck is a Hausa anyway? Well, I did some digging, and I can confirm that the Hausa is a completely made-up weapon that doesn't exist in reality. At least, not with that name. But what I find more curious is where that name even comes from. And one thing I found out is that the Japanese name for the weapon is identical, but spelled with katakana characters as opposed to hiragana characters, which suggests that the name is built out of words or pieces of words from other languages which are not Japanese, but I haven't been able to figure it out any further than that. Definitely curious to learn more about where the name comes from someday, or if the name is 100% completely made up. In any case, the Hausa is slightly more powerful than the sword when at the same level of power, plus has a range advantage, but can't hit enemies low to the ground and has a longer wind up and reuse time, meaning if you miss or need to attack again, you have to wait longer to do so. Well, that extra power boost though can end up being surprisingly necessary, as the game's internal logic in terms of how much damage you can do to an enemy or vice versa is entirely linear. What this means is that if your attack power is less than the enemy's defense power, your attacks will always do a grand total of 1 hit point of damage, which doesn't help when all enemies have 40 hit points, or 184 for bosses. I found the best strategy to ensure you don't get trapped with a boss that you can barely damage because of this is to ensure that you gain enough experience beforehand so that you can two-shot the strongest enemies in the area, and then you should be good. Although, if you do end up trapped by enemies or bosses, you do have a potential out. Hidden in a few secrets are the special attack techniques for the sword and Hausa. These attacks do the same amount of damage as your regular attacks, plus a bonus of 10 guaranteed damage, meaning you can 4-shot any opponent with them or 19-shot bosses, even if you don't have enough experience or equipment levels. The only catch is that these special attacks also drain your own health to perform. 8 hit points at first, though they can be reduced to 4 hit points with upgrades. In fact, one thing I like to do as soon as I cross the mountains and reach the meat of the game is to find a forest located along the western walls on the south side of the map. Now this forest normally just houses an HP upgrade, but the very first tree you reach inside it has apples, which serve a variety of purposes, meaning it's a really good spot to grind apples. Now you can have up to 99 apples at a time, each of which can either be sold for 1 jade each, consumed to restore a small amount of hit points, or more importantly, several secrets require you to have apples to access their contents, one of which is an upgraded bag, which increases your carrying capacity for all consumables. Now this bag is in a section you're normally not supposed to get to until way later in the game, but I like to go for it as soon as possible. Now, given that there's technically random encounters in this game, and you can't run from them, you would think that this strategy of mine would be foolhardy and stupidly dangerous, but there's some tricks to dealing with this. The white cloud clusters you see in the 3D view are the random encounters. If you touch one, you will get an encounter that you must win in order to continue on. However, only 2 of these clusters can be present at any point in time, and even though they tend to move towards your location, they're not very fast and always spawn either directly north or directly south of your current location, depending on which direction you're facing. This means so long as you're moving in an angle and not directly north or south, and so long as you don't stop moving, you will never get a random encounter. Or even if you do move directly north or south, you just have to dodge to the side when you see the encounter spawn and you're good. Anyways, let's talk about some of the environments in the game for a moment, because there's a wide variety of them. In fact, one of the first major dungeons you're expected to clear is a fire cave, which has all kinds of flaming obstacles and enemies to deal with. This is like one of those places you'd expect to find later in a game, not near the start. But this place also gives you a taste of the game's dungeon design and how evil it is. And don't get me wrong, the dungeons in this game are actually fairly easy to find your way around, but only so long as you keep 3 very important things in mind. Firstly, almost every dungeon has multiple levels. When you go up or down a staircase or fall down a pit, you transition to exactly the room which would be below, similar to in a Zelda game. This is pertinent because sometimes in order to make progress, you have to fall down pits. To that end, it's also important to remember that there's no such thing as a bottomless or inescapable pit. If you can fall through it, then there's a way back, and the fall itself will not inherently be painful, although the enemies waiting for you below might be. Secondly, and speaking of the enemies, some rooms have respawning enemies, and some rooms do not. For rooms where the enemies don't respawn, they will stay gone until you leave the location entirely and return. However, the rooms which do have respawning enemies can be important grind points if you're not yet powerful enough to tackle an upcoming boss. Now, thankfully, so long as you're grinding on enemies of a similar level of power, those grinds tend to go pretty quick, a few minutes at most. Lastly, almost every dungeon has multiple quote-unquote shortcuts back to the beginning. And I say it like that because these shortcuts are all one way and not marked ahead of time. Now, if you're making a map of your progress as you go, you'll spot these shortcuts from a mile away because your hand-drawn map will show a closed door on the other side of an open passage that you just found. Should you walk through, the door will indeed close behind you, essentially requiring you to go through sections you'd already been through to get back to where you were if taking the shortcut was unintentional. It's kind of evil that the game does this, but generally speaking, none of the dungeons are so big that this becomes anything more than a minor annoyance. You do have to be very careful though, because death in this game leads to a game over and back to the title screen, meaning when you go to continue, you will resume wherever you saved last, so saving often is really good advice. And speaking of advice, when you go to a temple to have a monk heal you and save your game, there's always a second monk there who has the ability to give you tips on how to proceed. Though sometimes these tips really don't help all that much. Even though the game is fairly straightforward in terms of what you have to do much of the time, there's also times where it's not 100% clear. For instance, once you get the musical score to play on the horn that you find in the desert, you're told where and when to play that new score, but the place you're supposed to do it almost makes no sense until you decouple your thinking from game logic and do exactly as you've been told. Play the song as soon as you exit a particular cave and are facing a star on the landscape, and there you go, your path opens before you. In fact, the game is filled with unconventional situations like this. Another example is the bow that you acquire. Now, you're actually able to return it to the hunter that it belongs to, and the game seems to indicate that you're losing the bow by doing so, but then the hunter decides he wants to spend more time with his daughter and thus gives the bow back to you. This plays the same sound effects and processes normally applied to acquiring new items, as opposed to just being descriptive, and it kind of makes you wonder if an exchange is actually happening or not internally, or if it's just being feigned. Now, speaking of the story, there is one noteworthy thing this game has going for it. The story is written very much like it was intended to be read from a book. Well, heck, if you completely blacked out the graphics, you would still know what was going on because of this. Which unfortunately also leads to a few moments, mostly later in the game and during the ending, where the written text completely contradicts what you're seeing on screen graphically. I guess the devs ran out of time to get those last few details sorted, which, to be fair, if you thought the gameplay itself was ambitious, wait till you beat this thing. I clocked it once, and the ending sequence, from the moment you lose control to the last unique thing happening on screen, is 23 minutes long. I've seen shorter endings from the Metal Gear franchise. And yes, there are dragons in this game, though only in the form of spirits and statues. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Dragon View. I riff on it only because I've played so much of it that I know its nuances pretty deeply. I will admit, the game is very basic when it comes down to it, but if you go into this without an FAQ or pre-made maps or such, then it's going to take you on quite the ride. And given that it has solid controls and simple mechanics, it's easy to get stuck into playing this thing for hours on end. It's not going to blow you away, but if you like any of the styles of gameplay on offer here, then you should still have fun either way. Anyways, next Agent DOS Games review will be a couple Saturdays from now, on the 25th, and we're going to be taking a look at a game which has something to do with intergalactic door-to-door salesmen. Yeah, I'm really not sure what to expect with this one either, so be sure to stay tuned to see what game I've got lined up for us all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random set of you guys.